right. Thanks for taking a few minutes to chat with me. I appreciate it.
Oh, for sure.
So can you give me a quick overview? I mean, tell me about Broken Caber. What's how to get started and what's your major goals?
So Broken Caber came about as a group to kind of continue and update the proposal throughout the years. I went to Scotland in 2018 with a group, set a bunch of records. Was actually the first adaptive athlete to ever throw in a sanctioned game on Scottish soil. And from there, when we got home, I got a call from the president of our SGHA. He wanted classifications made for adaptive classes, but he said, I'm not qualified to make them. I'm not an adaptive person. I was like, you're the first person I've ever heard in the adaptive space try to defer or gain even just some, major input on adaptive classifications from an adaptive athlete. So I took that mantle on. I used the Paralympic model as a model for us, and they've got 64 classifications, and I broke it down into four men's and four women's, a seated, a lower injury, an upper injury, and then kind of a catch-all for a lot of the disabilities you can't even see sometimes with a neuromuscular classification. In doing that, we're trying to create a level playing field. And, even then it's not a level playing field, but any Highland game thrower knows it's not a level playing field. 6'4", 260 ripped shows up, he's got an advantage that just is the way it is. So like in the lower, I'm a double amputee and I throw against a lot of single amputees, and single below the knee amputees, which is a total, it's adaptive class for sure, but it is kind of the sportiest of the, the most agile, because you got both your knees, you've got a full foot, and it's not a perfect level playing field, but it is as close as we can kind of get within the similar kind of throws. So, guys and girls that have upper injury, we kind of call that kind of a complete loss or inability to use one of the other of their arms. So like brachial plexus is going to be, I think, a big gather of injuries for that class. People have lost an arm. And, when you come in and maybe you've lost an arm and a leg, that's when we start talking. We haven't seen that yet, but that's where we're working on kind of getting some judges and people other than myself that are super knowledgeable to be kind of a judge on the field. We, as Broken Caber, we have no authority, and that was by design. ADs know how to run games. They just need the right information to be able to run a classification, is our view. And because of that, it's conversations. We don't do any fundraising. The group we went with prior to Scotland, there was some fuzziness about the fundraising when we got back. So to kind of distance myself from that, I just said, we're not going to fundraise for a while. And then it just became, we didn't need it. We don't, I don't want Broken Caber to become a fun place to play. It is a place to get the information to run the classifications around the world, to hopefully not need Broken Caber as an organization 10, 15, however many years from now, because everybody already has all the information. They know where to get it. They've run classes. Right now, it's just getting people out to play. I'm opening up classes all over the country, all over the world, a couple international ones that are using our classes. And it's tough to get adaptive athletes out. It's hard enough being a Highland Games thrower with full-time job, family, and having to pick, 3 or 4, hopefully, if you can get that many in a season, and then you add a disability on top of that. the cost, just the logistics. It can be very daunting and feel very, very off-putting. I can imagine. I'm a congenital amputee. I was fitted with prosthetics when I was before a year old, walked on time, won the 50-yard dash in first grade, so I've been on my legs for 40 years. And that was my main advantage in throwing. When we went to Scotland, I mean, for the stones, I was 5 to 7 feet further than second place. It was just, and it showed, and it was the mobility. And that's where I kind of learned, what I've done. I needed to start cataloging to be able to help. And because we are having a lot of people reach out. So what we've done is we've created Wandering Lost Adaptive Sports, which is a free coaching platform for adaptive athletes. And it is coached by the top adaptive athletes in the world. We have James Spurgeon as our single arm coach, Michael Bishop for our neuromuscular. Josh Watkins was actually the first person that I kind of coached when I started it. He's knocking on all the records in Highland Games for lower injury. And he's come on as kind of an associate coach, and that's free. And I've pushed it for years, and haven't gotten the response that we'd hope to see. We've had a couple athletes each year. A couple of them have made it into a gamers or two. A couple just, even if you start training for this as an able-bodied athlete, the sport's tough to get into. And one of the things that I really wanted to make sure that Broken Caber did with adaptive athletics was that it was not just a watered down version of Highland Games. It needed to be heavy and it needed to be difficult. And it, by design and just by its nature, is not something you come out and do for a weekend and then have a good time. So that is also a barrier that I'm, bumped my own head against. And I think trying to get people out. What we're developing now, and I've been working with another games and certainly wanted to work with you as well on a developmental adaptive league or class, which allows for lower weights, for girls to come in for a season, maybe 2 in that developmental class, but it's all with the arch to get to just the adaptive classes, almost like a B class or a C class. These will be, the developmental class, they might just be casting, the whole time. It's what we all had to bite the bullet and do, and doing that, we'll need, and what we're developing is a way to get people at least trained with, or ADs, to watch an adaptive athlete throw and say that's safe, or let's get you a lighter weight and maybe one turn, to the way we would do with able-bodied, especially when the B's and the C classes were starting to gain a lot. You had guys that you just didn't know where the thing was going to land, and I've seen some judges be like, "Hey, no more no more 2 turns, dude. Just get it out there." And that's also part of the sport, and it's the sport is humbling from the get-go, and that I think can also be a barrier for a newly adaptive or injured person, because you've been showered with all of this positivity you don't want, you as the athlete don't want the first not positivity to be to something that you did, you know what I mean? But we all know that that's how athletes are made ultimately. So we're working on that developmental so that we can get people out throwing, feeling the weights, do a couple, games at the developmental level, and then decide if you want to put the time and the training in. Because that's what I see even with the able-bodied classes. You can tell who trains, and at least has an eye towards Highland Games when they are training, from, especially when you see people year to year to year. And then, when these online registrations started, I had a couple ADs that I work with here on the East Coast they're really upset because these athletes are clogging up registration. They're jumping on registration before like legit dudes can get to it.
No kidding.
So I've seen a lot of games over here, kind of on the East Coast, go to a like a hybrid invitational or just flat invitational, because and that's the bigger games. It's the games that have the draw, and we've been lucky enough to be part of that, both by just being in the area and having really supportive ads and directors. Chad Clark, he's on the board for Broken Caber, and that board is just there to curate. Over the years, we've had very few reasons to have a meeting. Generally, so if one of us gets a suggestion or even an idea, we'll hit each other up and, do we need to meet about this, or is this silly, kind of thing. And it's really helped grow because it helps me kind of lean on a couple different people, because we've got Chad Clark. He's, kind of my AD guy. Christopher Hall, my brother, who is every CrossFit certification and wild man across the world, from Bear Grylls training school to, like, it was the school to become a trainer for Bear Grylls Academy, doing that, to just all these different things. He's had jobs where he's been able to do really cool stuff. And he's just an incredibly fit athlete and knows and understands the biomechanics. And he grew up right beside me as an adaptive kid, adult, and athlete. So he has an insight. We've got a orthopedic surgeon, Justine Crowley. Amanda Ford is still on the board as the female adaptive athlete. And then Chris, I always forget Chris's last name, but as another adaptive athlete. And that, say, that's just to have the ideas, have different perspectives when we get an idea or thought or just a way to improve the overall effectiveness of Broken Caber's proposal. Because again, that's what we push, not the organization, but the actual proposal. And, so we don't do any fundraising. We don't have any swag. A couple t-shirts have been made up. Anybody hits me up and is like, hey, can I make, 50 patches? I was like, sure, here's the PNG. We're not trying to make money. It's a fully open source, if you will. It was the way I felt like was the best way to kind of run that, and not step into the pitfalls of just fundraising an organization that doesn't need money.
So you've obviously consulted and worked with a lot of different ADs to get to the point that you're at. So for somebody like me, somebody who's just starting out with the adaptive classes, what does your average AD need to know that is different about welcoming the adaptive athletes to the field versus what they're used to?
It's not nearly as much as most people think, and that was by design in our proposal. For the most part, and the developmental class will change this a little bit, but right now, as it's proposed, all the weights are already on the field at most games. You might struggle with a light hammer, or some of the seated classes, but those are mostly women's masters weights. Men throw men's masters weight. So that cuts down on the need for extra equipment throughout the entire games. I've run wrestling tournaments at the regional and state level, so I understand time and space, and that's ultimately what we're asking for. And right now, as we're still kind of breaking in, it really does not take much more. You honestly can, if one or two adaptive athletes show up, they're still in the class, but you know, I've thrown with every class, just to be able to be on the field sometimes. And that's, we love it when we're with the pros, or, the pros women's, or the masters classes. Masters classes make the most sense because those are the weights that we're throwing for the most part. Hammer is the only one that's different, and it's an optional. What we keep records for men's hammer at the 12, the 16, and the 22, because for myself, I can't throw a 22 safely with my setup and my rig, what I've got. So I throw a 16 and a 12 if it's there. If not, I just throw the 16. So the equipment is not as definitely needed as it feels sometimes. The time, it's just adding a couple athletes to, if everything's full and you're at the brim and you've got a couple spots with the C class, we'll throw the C class. You know what I mean? So, we're very flexible as to where we are, because we don't really have the numbers throwing regularly to kind of make any kind of demand, let alone a request yet, that we throw specifically with another group or our own slot yet. And that's what we want to get to. We want to get to be able to say, and that we've got this many that regularly do this. I watched, when I kind of came on, I watched kind of the tail end of the women's class really develop and explode. And that's what I wanted to mirror, because what I saw was a group of 10 to 15 women, and it sounded like for 4 or 5 years committed to throwing and traveling and doing it regularly to show that there was a need for it. And that group was able to garner enough questions. Why aren't there women's groups here? Why don't we have women's masters? And that's what we aim for. We're just trying to create the questions, so that somebody sees us at a demo, goes back and talks to their, brother who knows an AD, why don't we have these people? And I'm still getting a lot of requests. Like you got, I've talked to 4 or 5, this is a very popular time with the season getting going. But surprised that I got so many requests to just be able to give you guys the information. Because, like I said, you guys know how to run classes. There's nothing that's different other than the weights they throw.
So I imagine that it's done a little differently from place to place, based partly on registration numbers. But is it typical to have an athlete in the mix with the class that they would normally be with, or is it more common to have maybe, say, all of your lower limb athletes together, whether they are considered amateur, masters, men, women? How does that breakdown normally happen?
So we don't. That's another thing we need the numbers for. We just have adaptive lower class, adaptive upper class, and the adaptive neuro. Once we get enough, the first class I want to also open up is a master's, because I think, a lot of guys are going to be injured. Women are going to be injured in midlife, early midlife. And, masters is a real thing, especially for adaptive athletes. When you hit that wall, I am face first on it right now, trying to get back on my feet. So that's one of the classes we want to open up first, is just a master's class for each of them. But that, I think, to even justify that, we've got to have at least enough numbers. So right now, everybody's, you throw within your class. We've not been split up. We've always had all the adaptive throwers with the pros or with the women, and they just go from event to event to try and create as little confusion, as especially for the scorekeepers. We are working with Heavy Athlete. He has the set categories to put in there. NASGA, there was 13 or 14 different wordings that people use, because there was not when I came on the scene, there was not any rules, and the records were just kind of myths or oral history. And so when somebody said, "Well, that's a record," I wrote it down. And we keep the records on Broken Caber. They're going to be kept on heavyathlete.com, which is going to allow us, when we get, two lower, two upper, and two neuromuscular guys, you want to run, combined class, because that's competitive there. What we'd like, the best way to do that is, of course, is the decathlon scoring, because that is a direct representation within your class how you stack up. Not widely used. I know heavyathlete.com is going to use that for one of their rankings. You'll be able to sort through that. So that's going to be extremely helpful for us in overall rankings as we try and work towards, holding a nationals. And then, we've got some guys throwing in Europe. We've got a big group that's throwing, that, they can maybe hold, a Europe's, and then we can do a worlds at some point. Because I've talked with the Masters World class, just kind of planting some seeds, for when that conversation becomes in earnest. And they've seemed very receptive. I've got to reach out. I've had a very preliminary conversation that we might be able to get a class into the World Sheaf Championships, and just let that be a run what you brung. Because if you go on Broken Caber, you'll see we have the records by class, and then we have an overall, and that is just, again, it's run what you brung. Again, you step up at 5'2" versus 6'4" guy, and 5'2" legit thrower, he could be kind of trash and still have an angle release point 4 feet higher than you, so sometimes that's the best way to do it. And it gives us, as the adaptive throwers, kind of a way to push each other a little bit rather than just in that one class. But once we can get that everything on Heavy Athlete, and that's lagging a little bit for stuff I need to get to him, we can really do that with that decathlon scoring. And so that's the kind of the way we run the overalls right now. The weights are the same. Seated is definitely different, and we have some things within the proposal to consider. We don't want to have rigid rules. That's part of the fun of Highland Games. There's rules, but there's suggestions a lot of times.
There's room for interpretation.
Exactly. So we do have some considerations, especially for like weight over bar. You got to test the athlete first. You got to let them know we're not going to set you up underneath the bar. You're going to have to do that yourself and take that on, if you want to set up under the bar. Another thing I tell athletes is, and this is a kind of a barrier statement, but it is just the way it is. Where these games are held. They're on fields. They're on grass. They're generally not next to the road. You have to take that into consideration for you. The events generally will help us however they can with a cart or something like that. But even yet, you've got to get from event to event. And if that means you've got to save up and get, the right tires on your wheelchair, or like in my case, just remind myself to sit down every once in a while, because I'm a stander, and then by the fourth event, I can barely catch my breath. So those are things that, while we at Broken Caber, our goal is to meet halfway to have a good class. And what I tell athletes is what they have to really understand. Halfway might mean that as an adaptive contingent, we have to do everything, 90% to get to that halfway, 90% of our capacity to meet it. They might have to take one step. Halfway is halfway. That's the way it is. We've got to put our own initiative and ingenuity and creativity into getting to that halfway point. And I've never walked away from a conversation with that from a negative light. Um, I've only had one or two games be like, not yet this year, but we will hit you up next year. Like generally, it's like, all right, yeah, let's just do it. Let's do the marketing because again, we're still in the getting people out phase. Um, I am working, just started working with Kilted Patriot to really start. They've got some stuff in Utah that really has done a great job getting athletes out for more than the weekend whitewater trip. Athletes come out and still be athletes, or maybe never knew they were an athlete until they got injured. And, you throw a seated shot put and you've got something special.
It actually kind of takes me right up to my next question for you, which was, I imagine that some of the folks who are actually clicking and watching this with curiosity in their mind here, do you have any message for adaptive athletes who are considering trying Highland Games for the first time, or for anyone in a disabled position who's just thinking about becoming an athlete for the first time? What do you suggest? How do you from you, what do you say to somebody who's just thinking about giving it a shot?
The first thing that I try to really get across is that adaptive is not scaled. And if you can keep that in your mind and not let someone scale something for you and call it adaptive, you're going to be in a good position because you're always going to be able to do it. It's when I was personal trainer, how should I do these sit-ups? Well, what's the hardest way? Then do that way. They always knew do it the hardest way if you want to get results. That doesn't mean it has to be painful, doesn't have to be excruciating, doesn't have to be anxiety inducing, but it's just a mindset to understand that you need to hold your own self to a standard because most people won't at first. They till they either get to know you're just you as a disabled or you for the first time just meeting you, because there's a tendency, and I came from CrossFit. That's what happened in the first 5 or 6 years of demos before they even did an adaptive class. They scaled. They didn't adapt. When you as an adaptive athlete, I could see it. I don't think other people, able-bodied, could see it as much. And I could just look and be like, no, that athlete is way more capable of doing a squat to a box for a wall ball. They can do that. It won't be as fast, but they can do it. And why aren't they? They're on the floor of the CrossFit Games. That stuff really stuck in my craw. So as we created Broken Caber, it was again difficult and heavy, so we don't dilute the sport. And so I guess that the first thing is you've got to hold yourself to your own accountability, which is really hard for someone like me, and I know it's really hard for other people. But if you can start weeding out what's being scaled and what's being adapted for you, that helps. And the other part is like we were just talking, it's not going to be easy. Um, it might not even be super fun at first, but it will be. And then when I say that, I mean the training. When you get into training and you start lifting heavy, or with thoughts of throwing heavy, or really taxing your body in a strength versus an endurance, or running, it really highlights what little stabilizer muscles you don't use regularly, all the little things that become super important, mostly for balance. um, and that's the key for an adaptive athlete. It's balance. I mean, it's a key for almost every athlete in every sport, but especially for adaptive athletes. So, like I said, when I started really seeing success, it was balance, doing kettlebell swings, doing side kettlebell swings, just continually creating off-axis movements that double up with strength and balance. That was my kind of, I don't want to say shortcut, but my secret that I didn't even realize I was doing. I was just bored in CrossFit, so I was just being silly or whatever, and then realized like, oh no, this really creates some really cool stuff. Um, and so it's balance. It's gonna suck some days. You're an adaptive athlete. That is just now part of your gig. You're a disabled person. If we want to just strip it down, that's just part of the gig now. And it doesn't have to be a lot. It doesn't have to be um, doesn't have to take you out of things. If you, for me, and I think for a lot of people that think the way I do, accept that, or even just fake accept it. When it happens, it doesn't come out of nowhere, and you can really kind of bear down, deal whatever your path is from that spot. You can see it more clearly, and it be less panicky, which takes balance down. That's how you fall. That's how you actually really hurt yourself in those moments. And so it's training those kind of autonomic responses as well. Because balance, it does it with all of that stuff. It really helps train those things up in a way that you just can't get with machines or cables or even just free weights, because you're lifting heavy and there are specific patterns that will hurt you. Um, but working with kind of kettlebells, and being not, also don't be afraid to reach down. You think you should be doing a 25, do a 15, but do twice as many, and you'll know if where you're at. And I say that's especially for adaptive athletes, picking the correct weights within a training session, because you can't compensate sometimes, depending on your injury. So you're more prone to an injury, even with weights that you were lifting previously. If you do bench press and now you're missing a right leg, that right side is now having to compensate for not having that stability. And so being really aware of those things, going lighter, do more reps, then start creeping the wave up. Um, I can keep going for hours on tips. And that's so. So I guess this is, come to Wandering Lost Adaptive Sports. There is a Facebook page. That's about the only place.
So something that I jotted down before, just to clarify. So you're saying that usually it is preferred to have all of the adaptive athletes grouped together in the same flight, regardless of what class they might normally throw with,
Yeah.
rather than having, the young men with the young men, the old women with the old women, and so on.
Generally, we've had very few women throw. The seated is its own. It's going to have, it can travel with, but there's going to be things that a seated athlete will need. And, I've talked to the ones that are doing it. Some do it in wheelchairs. We have provisions in there for a throwing stand in our proposal, how to use a throwing stand for Paralympic style, to those specs. When I've talked to ADs that there was a potential seated was going to show up, if you don't have to set the stand up in the trig and bust the trig for the rest of the flight. You can set it to the side and measure from there. That way the athlete can get the stability into the trig, because a lot of times there's downriggers that just screw into the grass, give that stability, and allows you to kind of leverage off the seat as well. And some of them will have a post if they're throwing with a stand. We've kept all those specs to the Paralympic specs, so that they can, you might get out there and throw a stone, 30 feet from a seated position. And, some of us know the right people to tag on Team USA. I went to 2 Team USA camps just that way, throwing in Highland Games with previous Olympic athletes. My name was kind of shuffled through, and I got invited to an interest camp, and then I went to a full week. They wanted to see if I could throw a javelin as well as I could push a rock, and they're definitely different. I love throwing javelin. I'm just not a prodigy at it. I'm just average, but I do it all the time. I still throw them in my backyard. I love it.
Nice.
So that's what I say. So those kind of things, we want to keep open because, man, if you can find some talent, that is where I think Highland Games, especially for an adaptive athlete, can pay off, because they are direct, and the classes for the amputees only came in 2018. Since 1964, amputees have always had to throw with clubfoot, nerve damage, up until 2018. Amputees did not have their own classes, and now there's 4, and they're all for the lower body. So they don't even have any, or maybe there's one. Yeah, maybe there's one for upper body. So even Paralympics are kind of lagging behind, in my opinion. I can't believe it took that long for those classes to be in the Paralympic, and it's new. And so what had happened is all the amputees just threw seated, and that's partially why I was invited, because all the seated throwers were aging out and we're not going to be throwing. They didn't have a crop of young seated throwers coming. I hope it's because they were all shooting for these 64 classes. It's T61 through 64 is the amputee classes, and we're going to see that rise because it's still combined with the nerve damage and like clubfoot or just different muscular diseases, until again you get enough people in that class to warrant whatever warrants having a full amputee class, whether it's the 61, 62, or even just combine those two. We'll get there. But again, this could be a track. Highland Games could definitely be a track to the Paralympic team, and that could be quite a experience that I only got that very little glimpse of going to a camp. I kind of ran my mouth a little bit when we got there. We were talking amongst ourselves, and we were talking about how I'd said, it's nice that we have a lot of able-bodied people with good intentions to do these adaptive classes, but until we have an amputee heading up the Paralympics, we're not going to, or heading up the amputee division, it's still only going to be from the perspective that's not ours. Happened to be talking to my coach. Hadn't met her yet, and she agreed on some levels, of course. And it's something that I've really pushed, and it was nice that before it even crossed my mind with Highland Games, they reached out. Scotland reached out and said, we need this, and we want someone who clearly shows an aptitude for this to do these classifications.
Well, it sounds like they got the right guy.
I hope so, man.
No, you've been super helpful to me. I mean, I didn't want to be that guy just making my best guess. So just even finding the website and finding those resources, reading through them,
I appreciate it.
Made it feel like, all right, this is something that I feel like I can do and not come across as an idiot. So who knows? I'm gonna this first game that we're talking about here in May. It's not the biggest field in the world, so we got a cap on it of around about 30 athletes. But I think my plan is going to be, if I hit that cap and I don't have a good representation yet from the adaptive classes, I'll keep that portion of registration open and longer, and I'll see who else I can find. But I do think it's going to be finding a lot of people, locals, who, right now they don't exist. They're not in throwing circle, or they're not. They have no idea the opportunities out there. So that's going to be part of the big push. We are working closely on this games with a lot of different local veterans organizations. It's a charity games for some of those vets organizations, and I'm hoping that through the promotion with them, that we might also connect with some of the adaptive athletes that way in that direction.
Excellent.
But we also, in June we'll have our clinic. We've done our clinic for the last 3 years, and it's been it's been successful. It's just gotten more successful every year, getting new folks to come out and give the games a try. This year it'll offer up the adaptive classes, and
let's plan.
I guess I'll be having to figure out how to instruct or how to advise any brand new adaptive athletes who want to come out to the clinic and try the games for the first time.
I could come out. I think we could try to make that work in June.
Hey, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Anything I can do to help out with that stuff. Any questions?
I don't want to take too much of your time, but I do appreciate you chatting with me today. You gave me a lot of info and answered a lot of questions for me, so appreciate it.